When Bill asked me to speak, I proposed an inspiring narrative around what the trends that we're seeing in food can say about trends we're likely to see in what we drink. So hence this was my first title. But it's really not just that, I realized. This is about the notion of making your business future-friendly, ensuring you're in a place to pivot when the market presents you with a novel ingredient or consumers revolt against plastic bottles. And as often happens in the life of entrepreneurs and editors, I still didn't feel okay with it. What felt like solid ground started to feel shaky and brittle under my feet, and I came up with yet another title. Because it's really hard to predict things like Amazon buying Whole Foods or America's soaring appetite for nut milk or the rise of ecological packaging. But maybe together we can come up with some trends that we feel reasonably strong about. My entry point into all this is that I eat and drink, sometimes an unfair amount, in the name of research. It's a really good excuse for anyone who's in the food and drink business to say that everything's in the name of research. And I get fed an endless stream of samples and press releases and stories and data related to what we are eating and drinking. Partly that's because Edible Communities puts on a series of drinks-focused events throughout the year in New York City. This is me attending one of those, where we focus on chronicling and celebrating those drink startups alongside more established pours, more established drinks brands. But where I also sit is being in touch with editors in the 100 territories that now have edible magazines around the country. So when in 2007 we saw kombucha taking off in Brooklyn with a rash of about 6 companies launching, or a couple years later we saw Brooklyn bartenders making their own bitters, or just a couple years after that we saw varietal rosés showing up on tasting flights on Gotham drinks lists. We could confirm that that was also happening in Austin and San Francisco and Chicago and Missoula, Montana, and anywhere that an edible exists. I see this melding of the food and drink movements most acutely in my own backyard. This is signage from Indian Ladder Brewing, a cider and beer producer, a farm cidery and farm brewery in New York's Hudson Valley. The tagline, "Drinking is an agricultural act," is a phrase adapted from the poet-farmer Wendell Berry, who famously said, "Eating is an agricultural act," with the certainty that how we eat can drive changes in how we farm. In the case of Indian Ladder, the rapid rise of cider drinking in New York gives the thousands of apple farms in the state a second lease on life. The same can be said for local gins and local whiskeys and brown spirits who are required by law, at least in New York and a bunch of other states that have farm distillery laws, to use a majority of local grains and other feedstocks. Because the same people who care about the beef in their burgers will also care about the rye in their whiskeys. And if there's one idea to leave you with today, it's that. The clearest trend is that people want more information, fewer ingredients, more of an origin story behind their food. And I'm going to suggest it will be the same for drinks, and I think we've already heard that. These shifts in food consciousness mirror what we're seeing in terms of drinks consciousness, and that's really the macro trend. But within this, I want to dip into a few micro trends, some of which we've heard about today, but maybe I can reinforce them with some additional examples. So you probably know at least 2 out of the 3 folks in this picture. Over the last 5 years, chefs have emerged as leading voices and activists in food politics, and I want to suggest that a trend we need to watch is that every producer and every consumer is now an activist. They've raised the bar for everyone in the food business, people like Tom Colicchio and Jose Andres, who've made it a responsibility within their chef role to to get involved in politics, to get involved in charity and mission-focused work in a big way. And drinks makers are no different, being smart about taboo ingredients like high fructose corn syrup, or choosing the right mission and charity alignments like a percent for the planet. These are all important decisions that are part of constructing a brand. You might have seen Finlandia Vodka's campaign in the last couple of years, riffing on its longtime brand narrative of purity, launching last year a Pure Water campaign that featured charity partners working to remove plastics from oceans, to raise oysters to help clean polluted harbors, and to increase access to clean water. According to a vodka distributor that I spoke to on the East Coast, this campaign led to a double-digit bump in Finlandia sales in that year, something they hadn't seen in a while, and this was partly built on getting it poured at higher-end, more fussy bars and restaurants. Millennials, blah, 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 millennials. So it's really not worth saying anything that's already been said, but this is a report from Goldman Sachs called Millennial Munching. It's got some good statistics in it. The big takeaway for me is that millennials represent 80% of the growth in the food vertical in the next 20 years by their calculations, and I think drinks are right up there with it. And that millennials are different in the sense that consumers used to rank their 3 top choices when they were buying food to be price, convenience, and taste, and price has dropped down the list for millennials. They are willing to spend a higher percentage of their disposable income on food and drink experiences. It's not that they're not completely negligent of what something costs, but they're willing to spend a higher percentage. And if you haven't checked out this book and you're looking for some really concrete examples of how millennials are affecting the food and drink landscape, this is a very good one by Yves Thureau-Paul. So next trend, the more transparent, the better. A few years ago, Organic Valley, the largest organic dairy producer in the United States, launched regional labeling. This was incredibly radical for a generic, homogeneous commodity. It wasn't easy, and it required them to segment their distribution and packaging in really complicated ways that were clearly not going after the lowest cost of production, but it was something that their co-op members wanted to do. And so now if you're in New York, you can buy Organic Valley milk from New York growers. If you're in California, it says on the label, this is from our California members. And their customers really liked it, and it was a great call to action for those customers. But all sorts of brands are doing this. In the last year, Belvedere Vodka rolled out new promo material speaking for the first time about themselves as a type of single origin or estate-grown vodka. They've always been getting their rye from the same large farm in Poland, but they never made a big deal about this. Why hadn't they before? Ostensibly, they didn't think people cared about it. This is an ad campaign from the Silicon Valley food maker Hampton Creek, a unicorn with a unicorn valuation, despite the fact that it's been troubled by scandals over the last few years. What I see as really innovative about what Hampton Creek is doing is that they have pioneered a type of eco-footprint labeling. On some of their products, they indicate the savings of certain nutrients or certain pollutants compared to their competitors. And this was actually a poster campaign that was at 7-Elevens and convenience stores all over the country. So, this is a radical departure from what brands are usually sharing with consumers. And if you want to get really far out in thinking about the sort of traceability notion and where it could go in the future, you should check out the work of the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. They came up with this idea of a meat counter of the future in a supermarket. And you can see that not only is our range of where we're getting our meat completely different than where we get it today. It includes roadkill, it includes invasive species, in vitro lab grown, but the notion that there's complete transparency, there's nothing that they're trying to hide. Reducing food waste is also about the beverage industry. There's been this realization that we waste roughly 40% of all the food we harvest, and it's sending shockwaves through the food industry, whether it's lost on the farm or in shipping or in our kitchens. It's a moral concern, but more than anything else, it's an economic concern. The Rockefeller Foundation estimated that it's $2 trillion in food value that's lost every year worldwide as a result of food waste. And the next generation, as you can see here in this photo, this is a group of kids who are learning how to compost near Union Square in New York City. This generation is growing up to see food waste as an anathema, as a crime. You know, they wouldn't litter, and they wouldn't throw away a piece of trash, and they're realizing now that they wouldn't throw away food. And I think we're going to see and expect the same from beverages. In my area on Long Island, there's a new distillery called the Matchbook Distilling Company in Greenport that has launched with the plan to make spirits entirely out of waste ingredients, whether it's grape juice that a winery is not going to use, or large quantities of imperfect produce or fruit acquired from a nearby food distribution plant. And rather than take this as a sort of Spartan challenge, Matchbook is using it as a differentiator. They have plans to open in cities around the world, and in each place to focus on using some feedstock that would be wasted otherwise. And there are all sorts of incredible examples of beverage brands doing this, like watermelon water, which features parts of the melon and huge quantities of melon that would be discarded otherwise. Misfit Juice in Washington, D.C. is sort of using a similar tactic around grocery store produce that would otherwise be thrown out. And now there's Toast Ale that was recently launched in the United States, and this is a beer made entirely from bread and bakery products that would be thrown away. This effort to reduce waste also takes the form of harnessing uncommon and underused ingredients. I think of this as expanding the palette we use to paint our beverages from. There is a new brand of tea that just launched in Brooklyn called Lion Tea that's made mostly from dandelion greens, hardly a commodity crop, and other underused but widely available botanicals. And I kind of see as part of the same trend brands like Oatly and Oatworks and Califia and Malk and macadamia milk and the long list of other nut drinks. Nuts were just not being used in this way before. And to also echo a point that has been made today, digital technology, and maybe you can broaden it to say Silicon Valley culture, is transforming food and beverage culture in ways that we can't even imagine. I've been following the ready-to-drink market for a while, and for the longest time it seemed like Soylent was the only player in this market. And now there's an explosion of competitors, which are all distinguishing themselves from Soylent, simply saying that Soylent's ingredient label looks like a chemistry experiment. And so now there's brands like Ambronite out of Scandinavia that it calls itself a drinkable super meal, but it has all whole foods ingredients, whether it's oats or berries, and no chemicals in the ingredient list. In one of my talks with Bill before this event, Bill noted that more and more drinks, quote, more and more drinks that are essentially a salad in a bottle. And it's one example of how food and the confluence between food and beverage are coming together. He said it more eloquently than that, but I didn't write it down so well. How are you preparing yourselves, your brands, and your investments in beverage for this trend towards people essentially mixing powder and water and treating that as an entire meal, a drinkable meal? And then there's this other trend happening around technology, which I think of as the miniaturization of the food chain. We want to do that last step at home, whether it's being a world-class mixologist because you can buy a device that allows you to make your own cocktails at home, or it's a device like BrewBot or Pico Brew, which are allowing you to brew beer in your house with virtually no experience whatsoever. There will be companies that fail. There are also wild successes, like the data-driven, geek-targeted Blue Bottle Coffee, which was recently acquired by Nestle and attracted investment from Google Ventures and other Silicon Valley firms, partly because it was so tech-forward in terms of brewing technology and mobile payments and social-first content strategy. We heard from Nick earlier about sensors moving into all facets of our life, and sensors are moving into the food chain. There are companies making soil sensors, making sensors that go onto tractors, and there is now a number of companies making sensors that can go onto bottles. Jack Daniel's is piloting smart bottles that can be inserted into cases and tracked after sale to help them understand and monitor inventory flow and shelf life and speed of consumption. And I recently had the chance to do a bar crawl in Chicago and saw firsthand at a new bar called the Leviathan, where technology that was being used in the kitchen was now being moved, across that wall from the kitchen to the bar. There was sort of unlimited stuff being done with freezing and creating ice, different sorts of ice. There was an edible flower that was flash frozen and put in the one drink on the top left. And that's a ginger blossom. So as the ice melted, you kind of had this ginger flavor that entered the drink. And then the drink at the bottom with the Lord of the Rings looking mug, was entirely based on ice, entirely built of ice. And it was only as it melted that you got to enjoy it. And if we see sort of, those bars that are leading the way, you see a company like the Aviary out of Chicago, which just opened in New York, and they are just trying to do the weirdest and wackiest stuff with cocktails that they can possibly imagine, and people are forming a line outside the door for that. And in fact, we launched an event in New York City last year called Food Loves Tech to offer the public a glimpse of those technologies that are rapidly entering our food chain, from robots on farms to 3D printed pizza to smart kitchen appliances. This year, the event is November 3rd and 4th in Brooklyn, and I invite you all to join us. We will have quite a bit of beverage technology, and I really love everyone's impression. But the big takeaway is this has been a very popular event for us, and we're finding that both on the industry side and on the consumer side, people are curious. They're frightened to some extent, but they're also very excited about technology wending its way into our food chain. The bottom line is that the divide between the kitchen and the bar is coming down, that what's on our plates versus what's in our glass is becoming blurred with more and more overlap in trends and desires. So I would encourage everyone to keep your eye on how food production, food making, and food delivery are changing, because beverage will not be far behind. Thank you.